So the horribly predictable has happened. What seems to be conservative-leaning person, by Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's estimation, committed a politically motivated unalienation. That might have to be censored because it's the beginning of the YouTube video of Minnesota lawmaker Representative Melissa Hortman. Her husband was also injured. The victim also went to another Democratic state senator, John Hoffman's house, and wounded him and his wife, Yvette, in another attempted, it would seem, alleged unalienation. Two of the victims were Democrats and their spouses. And the guy seems to have been right-leaning. Who could have seen this coming in the country where the overwhelming majority of domestic that occurs gets carried out by the right, by right-wingers, by white supremacists, by anti-state right-wing extremists, by anti-abortion extremists, by anti-Semites. There's a whole laundry list and history of right-wingers having the largest share of being the ones that commit acts of domestic terrorism in the United States of America. This is not a secret in America. It's not even close to something that you need to do any amount of digging to find out. Paints a clear picture of the right wing in this country being more likely to enact violence on others for political reasons. And who could expect that to be the case? The party that fetishizes guns, that fetishizes violence and enjoys seeing violence done onto others that aren't them, that want mass deportation, for instance, which is an incredibly violent act, or I guess a systemic collection of violent acts that necessitates violence in order to carry it out. Just the side of the political spectrum in the United States of America that just happens to be more okay with violence being done to, the other people they don't like, is also the side that's going to be more likely to go out and do things like this. On June 14th, at 9:47 a.m., Governor Tim Walz spoke on this.
Unspeakable tragedy has unfolded in Minnesota. My good friend and colleague, Speaker Melissa and her husband Mark, were shot and killed early this morning in what appears to be a politically motivated assassination. Our state lost a great leader, and I lost a dearest of friends. Speaker Hortman was someone who served the people of Minnesota with grace, compassion, humor, and a sense of service. She was a formidable public servant, a fixture and a giant in Minnesota. She woke up every day determined to make this state a better place. She is irreplaceable, and we've been missed by so many. Minnesota's thoughts and prayers are with her family, her loved ones, her children, and her parents.
So I, for one, will give Tim Walz a whole bunch of credit for calling it what it is, which is a politically motivated assassination. As the governor, that's pretty good. I've seen a lot of reporting on it that just use the words shooting and doesn't call it an assassination. That seems to be, as far as we can tell from the available evidence, what it was. So Representative Melissa Hortman was one of the top Democrats in Minnesota. So, an obvious target for anybody who wants to take out a political opponent. Her husband was also injured, but fortunately survived. And then this guy also went to, like I said earlier, another state senator's house and attempted to do the same thing, but both of them survived, the state senator and his wife. So there was very clearly intention behind this. And there was in my mind, in my opinion, clearly political motive. Because why is the person only targeting Democrats? So then, some time passes. Eventually, a suspect is named. The piece of shit's name is Vance Bolter. So it turns out, this is video from Melissa Hortman's front door camera, where the dude showed up impersonating a police officer, wearing a mask, apparently knocked on the door several times, said he was police, lying, of course. Eventually, Melissa Hortman and her husband open the door, regrettably. One thing leads to another, and then he shoots and kills her. And you might be wondering, how do we know the motivations here? You could draw some assumptions based on the targets. Turns out, he had a whole list. He had a laundry list of Democratic politicians that he was hoping to be able to do the same thing to. Fortunately for the rest on the list, only 2 were made attempts on before he was, found and captured, and is now being charged. So, how else do we know what this guy's been up to? Friends and former colleagues interviewed by the Associated Press described Bolter as a devout Christian. So, you could be a Republican or Democrat if you're a devout Christian, who attended an evangelical church. All right, so it's more likely you're a Republican, but I'm sure it's not impossible for a Democrat to find their way to an evangelical church, and went to campaign rallies for President Donald Trump. Records show Bolter registered to vote as a Republican while living in Oklahoma in 2004. It was some time ago, before moving to Minnesota, where voters don't list party affiliation. There's a little bit more. If you dig into the guy a bit more past all that, I think most reasonable people, given this information, would assume that this guy did not like the Democrats. Seems unlikely that this guy was a Democrat. But you can go even further than that. The CNN article writes, Bolter largely shied away from political posts on his publicly available social media accounts and did not discuss abortion rights in any religious speeches reviewed by CNN. However, in one talk he gave in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2023, he appeared sharply critical of LGBTQ rights. So, I don't know about you. I don't think the average centrist that might have some misgivings with like queer people or abortion rights or whatever, the mythical centrist voter, I don't know that they would be willing to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo to give a speech about their anti-LGBTQ views. So just many more pins in the right-wing column. He said, quote, there's people, especially in America, they don't know what sex they are, they don't know their sexual orientation, they're confused. The enemy, he says, has gotten so far into their mind and their soul, he said in a sermon at a Pentecostal church in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know that you can make a good argument that this was a left-winger. Obviously, you wouldn't expect anybody to claim that he was, but of course there would be dumbasses who do. Maybe not directly, but one such dumbass is President Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America. This is posted several days later, where a reporter asks President Donald Trump if he has called Governor Tim Walz, yet after a Democratic lawmaker was assassinated in a politically motivated shooting, and another Democratic state senator was injured by the same guy who had a list of a variety of other Democratic politicians that he had hoped to, it would seem, do the same thing to. So here's the Republican President of the United States of America's response to even the suggestion that he might call a governor of the state that happens to be a Democrat about it.
Have you called the governor yet or been able to speak to any of them?
I don't really call him. Look, he appointed this guy to the position. I think the governor of Minnesota is so whacked out. I'm not calling him. He's a mess. So, I could be nice and call him, but why waste time?
I don't know about you. I feel like the only possible response as the President of the United States that you should have when it comes to seemingly a supporter of yours going out and assassinating your political opposition, a Democrat, would be like, you should be doing the absolute most to separate yourself from the guy, even though he seems to be a fan of and perhaps a voter of yours, condemn the violence, call the governor of the state. You think you do a lot of these things to kind of give the appearance that you give a shit that it happened, and also hope that it doesn't happen again, right? Because you wouldn't, if you were a normal person, if you were a decent human being that didn't want violence to be done, even to your political opposition, who you hope to beat in elections and whatnot, you'd think most normal, reasonable people would try to do the most to make it clear that that kind of violence is not acceptable. But no, the current administration and the leader of it don't seem to care too much that one of their political opposition was killed in a politically motivated shooting, allegedly. They don't seem to care at all. They're not even going to call the governor. It's almost like they don't particularly mind if Democrats just happen to stop existing. If their political opposition just happens to stop existing, through whatever means, You wouldn't want a guy to go out and 187 them, but if it happens, what are you going to do, right? Surely it was nothing to do with any of the rhetoric of the right wing, who have called Democrats, pedophilic baby eaters that are coming for your children and are an existential threat to the existence of the country, and something that, you would think somebody who doesn't want their family hurt, doesn't want the country they live in hurt, doesn't want a variety of things that the Republicans claim Democrats are going to hurt, perhaps even violently, you'd expect those people to want to, in their mind, self-defense, enact a form of violence in defense of it, right? Maybe this Vance Bolter guy heard all that and was like, well, if these Democrats are trying to kill a million bajillion babies by allowing for family reproductive care to be up to the people that are involved in it and not some dude in a suit that claims to know better than the person who's carrying a child. If that person hears all that and it's like, oh, it's an existential threat to the country, this is what the president is saying, you could make an argument in that insane person's mind that it would be an act of self-defense to, you know, make these Democratic lawmakers stop putting these laws forward or whatever, right? I think it's not that far of a stretch to think that, you know, Trump just doesn't really care that somebody who opposed him politically, who's a Democrat, got killed. And you have other people. This tweet was deleted, but it stayed up for quite some time. The Republican elected representative, Mike Lee, posted the screenshot of the killer going up to Hoffman's house to assassinate her. He wrote, "This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way." Which, for one, what does that even mean? It's like entirely absurd. If you were to show that to any normal person, they'd be like, what the hell is this guy talking about? But if you dig into it further, this Mike Lee guy has a history of being incredibly right-wing, incredibly inflammatory because he wants to lay epic own the libs or whatever. And because there's a whole cottage industry of conservatives and right-wingers, aka the Republican Party, that work overtime anytime a right-winger does domestic terrorism to claim it was the left wing every single time, because they understand that the abundance of evidence out there points to the right wing and conservatives being the most likely to commit acts of terror in the United States of America, their voters. Here he's suggesting, oh, it must have been that there's some Marxist out there that was upset that the Democrats weren't socialists or something and wanted to force their hand to do more left-wing things by killing one of them or something. It's like, it's actually absurd, and it points back to the conspiracy theory that's going around in right-wing circles that, oh, since the killer was appointed by Governor Tim Walz's predecessor and then reappointed by Tim Walz, he must be like a Democrat. He must have done this in order to make the Republicans look bad and is actually like a left-winger or whatever. Even though, as a governor, you're not just a governor of the Democrats of a state, you're the governor of the Democrats and Republicans that happen to be in the state, both the elected representatives and the voters. There are so many times that governors will appoint members of their political opposition. You know, you'd hope there would be a fair amount of bipartisanship if one of the parties wasn't batshit insane, like the Republicans are. I'm not the biggest fan of bipartisanship in a broad context of the United States of America, because I think the Republican Party is an irredeemable piece of shit that should not ever have any political relevance ever again. Shouldn't have had for a long, long time, but definitely not after, you know, January 6th, and definitely not after this. Because so many of the people that use inflammatory rhetoric on the right that are elected to positions just have nothing really to say other than, oh, maybe at best thoughts and prayers about this happening and other such things happening. They don't care about right-wingers committing violence, and you could potentially argue that some of them kind of like it, you know, when that happens. Republicans tend to have a fair amount of difficulty winning elections fairly, so they have to do a lot of voter suppression to begin with to stop, you know, black and brown people from voting, to stop anti-war people from voting in the past, which was why, you know, weed and whatnot was criminalized. A whole bunch of methods to try to make the least amount of people vote as is possible have been put into place primarily by the Republican Party because they understand that they're not popular enough to win elections just from popular vote or whatever. The entire infrastructure of the Electoral College is a participation trophy for the Republican Party because absent it, Republicans would never win national elections ever again. And so, I don't think that a lot of the more insane ones would really bat an eye at extra electoral means, let's say, of, you know, making sure Republicans gain more power in the political system. Especially if the guy was targeting a whole bunch of Democrats that are very effective in the Minnesota government, like, say, Melissa Hortman. This is a post from her Blue Sky profile from June 6, 2025. Next Monday, we will finish the work of the 2025 legislative session. In addition to balancing the budget, DFLers has successfully protected nearly all of our 2023 accomplishments, and we will continue to fight for a future where everyone can get ahead, not just billionaires and big corporations. So we got the Minnesota legislature, 2025 accomplishments. We've seen a variety of wins in the Minnesota government, even with very slim majorities for Democrats, where they have passed universal school meals. Student lunch debt isn't a thing in Minnesota. If you have a kid that's going to school, they are going to be fed, end of story. There's no child that's going to go hungry. They allow for paid family and medical leave. There are laws on the books that make it so that a company has to pay you family and medical leave for a variety of reasons, instead of, having you be on your own because you want to start a family in an economy that requires multiple incomes in order to pay the goddamn bills. Protected abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, a whole bunch of really good things that most normal people seem to support. Melissa Hortman was a big part of that. It makes you wonder why the guy didn't like her so much as to kill her, Just a guess on my part. There hasn't, unfortunately, been enough Democrats, in my opinion, who have come out against this. Because, in my view, the Republican Party should not be allowed to continue to have political relevance. They shouldn't have had it for a long time. They've been fighting tooth and nail to keep it, even though they are deeply unpopular. This should be something that Democrats never shut up about. The abundance of right-wing domestic terrorists should be a very common thing talked about by the Democratic Party. Because in this case, their fucking lives depend on it. It's often the case that it isn't lawmakers and elected politicians that are the targets of these things, but sometimes it is. It's easy for a lot of Democrats to ignore a lot of the domestic terror that right-wingers, Republican voters do, but that's because it's not happening to them. Now it is. If there's a whole list, if there's one elected Democrat assassinated, another one injured, and a whole list of potential other targets that the dude wasn't able to get to, this should worry you, I think, if you're an elected Democrat. Maybe I'm crazy, Maybe I'm out of my mind. But I feel like if I was in a position of power and a bunch of my peers that shared similar views to me were getting killed or targeted in things like this, or even a bunch of voters or organizations, leaders are getting targeted by with violence, I'd probably worry a little bit for my own safety. Seems like something that would be on the top of my mind, but it's not as much of an issue as it should be. If it happened to a Republican, they would never shut up about it. So one of the few times that a left-winger did anything similar to this was the baseball shooting. There's like a congressional baseball game, and there was a dude that was like a Bernie voter that shot it up and didn't kill anyone. They went with that and would not shut up about it for a long time. Oh, these violent Democrats. Because that's one of their core planks, is that, Democrats and left-wingers are violent. See also the overwhelmingly peaceful Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 that they claimed were so violent. See also the very recent anti-ICE protests. Sure, a couple driverless cars were set on fire with no human casualty at all, but the overwhelming majority of the violence that's occurring at these protests happens because of the police. There will be a bunch of people that are demonstrating their First Amendment rights to peacefully protest, and then eventually the police, for whatever reason, because they want to clear the road and allow traffic to come through or whatever, end up launching tear gas into the crowd, shooting people with rubber bullets incorrectly, mind you. They should be ricocheting them off the ground, but they end up just aiming them directly at people, which can severely hurt people, make people lose eyes, or even kill them. The majority of the violence that's happening is because of the police in those instances, but they will lie and claim that the left wing is so violent. If that's the consistent messaging from the Republican Party, obviously if there was a Democratic voter or somebody that espoused left-wing views, like an opposite of the Vance Bolter here, that was very right-wing in his views, and was registered to vote Republican in Oklahoma in 2004, if it was all flipped and it was a Democrat, Republicans would never shut up about it, because it goes along with their false narrative of Democrats and left-wingers being violent, even though that's what they are. Projection is like one of the oldest things in the book, and it's very clear that Republicans do it all the time. They can't exist without it, because they need to lie in order to get power, but it's not something that is being made into a major issue in the Democratic Party. I'm not sure why. There have been a couple, though. A couple Democrats. So we got Chris Murphy here. He's a senator, I believe, from Connecticut, who's been a bit better about it, thank God. And the governor, Tim Walz, also called it a political assassination, so I appreciate that for calling a spade a spade. Chris Murphy wrote, "The Minnesota assassin appears to be a hate-filled right-winger. So can we stop walking on eggshells about MAGA's legitimization of political violence?" It's not just MAGA, by the way. It's Republicans at large. MAGA is Republicans. There's no reason to separate this. You can just call them Republicans because they control the party. They're in the White House. right now. There's no reason to differentiate them, but for some reason Democrats feel the need to. He continues, yes, Republicans have also been the target of inexcusable violence, but this isn't a both sides issue. For the last 5 years, MAGA has been bathed in political violence. Most importantly, MAGA's celebration of January 6th and Trump's decision to pardon all the January 6th rioters, including the most violent, became a clear endorsement of violence committed in his name. But it didn't start with January 6th. Some could say it went all the way back to the Civil War. You know, some could say it went all the way back to John Wilkes Booth, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. You know, a whole bunch of political violence has been done by the right wing, like the KKK. But, you know, we can follow this along. But it didn't start with January 6th. Trump regularly threatened protesters at his rallies with violence. He cozied up to brutal dictators abroad who use violence to maintain political control. There was no comparison in Democratic messaging. Never has been. Never has been. And we cannot discount the impact of MAGA's fetishization of guns. MAGA celebrates the tools of mass shooters and assassins, assault rifles, machine guns, silencers, high-capacity magazines. MAGA doesn't treat firearms with respect, it celebrates their killing power. This is very true. I'm a big fan of firearms, have been for a long time. I'm a big fan of responsible firearm ownership, being if you don't think that you'd be comfortable to have one, you shouldn't get one. And if you do, you should understand all of the ramifications that come with that. You should regularly train in their use and understand just how dangerous they can be. There's a whole bunch of shit that goes into owning a firearm, and I far be it for me to assume that a lot of the dumbasses on the right side of the fence don't follow a lot of that. He continues, Trump sends other clear signals supporting political violence, said he might pardon those that plotted the kidnapping, who knows what they might have done to her if they were successful in kidnapping her, of Governor Gretchen Whitmer, threatened peaceful protesters of his military parade with assault. Again, Democrats don't say these things, it's not both sides. The deployment of the National Guard and Marines to LA was the next escalation. Trump sent the military into LA to inflame and create the conditions for more violence. It was completely unnecessary, and a lot of the National Guard that were sent there didn't want to be, and were kind of annoyed by it. It seems like his absolute failure of a birthday party military parade that nearly nobody showed up to, especially not compared to the No Kings protests on the same day, you know, aside from the people that were paid to go, like the people that work for him. The military there didn't seem to want to be there either, because they were not marching in lockstep. They were just kind of walking. It was highly unnecessary and in many views illegal, but he did it specifically because he wanted a reason for a military crackdown. He wanted a reason to be able to use this as a show of force and to help create evidence for his narrative of, you know, these left-wing democratic cities being on fire and falling apart and needing a strong man like him to be able to fix them. Never really been the case, but they gotta fabricate evidence because there isn't any actual evidence, so I guess this is what you end up having to do. The assault of Senator Padilla was the natural result of these purposefully heightened tensions. This was when Senator Padilla went to one of Kristi Noem's public, I think it was like a news conference or whatever. He, in the video, very clearly identified himself as a senator, but he was pushed out and eventually thrown to the ground and arrested for the crime of asking Kristi Noem a question that was germane to her experience. But I guess asking questions is violence. So, you know, you can't have that either. They claim that he didn't identify himself, but he very clearly did. To get into that building to begin with, it requires a whole bunch of hoops that you need to go through to even be in the building. See, there's not really much excuse for, like, oh, well, I didn't know who he was. We thought he was just some rando. It doesn't really make sense. When MAGA uses violence against its political opponents and endorses private acts of violence when committed in service of MAGA, unhinged people listen, mostly on the right, but also on the left. Once violence gets mainstreamed, it's hard to put it back in the bottle. So you can see this happen every time a right-wing domestic terrorist goes out and does domestic terrorism. Say that shooting of that queer nightclub in Colorado Springs. Immediately after it happened, the right wing, either the most insane ones, openly celebrated it happening because they are like, oh, a whole bunch of queer people got killed, let's go. Or they muddy the waters and claim it was a left-winger or something like that. The motherfucker, even the shooter himself, pretended to use they, them pronouns in order to throw the prosecution off the scent of it potentially being a hate crime, even though it so clearly was an anti-queer hate crime. Eventually, the shooter's lawyer stopped using they, them pronouns because it was clear it wasn't going to work. But there's so many different things that the right wing does to obfuscate the fact that they are violent, they like the violence that happens, and they don't mind seeing more of it at the very least. Like, it's very clear if you are able to, follow a couple sentences put together of factual information. It's hard for a lot of Republicans to understand this if they don't already, if they're not in favor of the violence. But I think most reasonable people should be able to understand that it's completely one-sided. The majority of the violence that happens in this country that is politically motivated is done by right-wingers, Republicans, conservatives. And any kind of obfuscation or lies or smears against left-wingers whenever one of these right-wingers does this shit is just a method of playing defense for the right-winger that did it. The people that wanted Derek Chauvin to be pardoned even are part of this. They're okay with violence being done to what they see to be either their political opposition or, people that they don't like minorities and whatnot, It's true the violence is sometimes trained on Republicans, including Trump. Yesterday, in fact, was the anniversary of the congressional baseball shooting. Well, there you go. I was talking about that. And yes, there have been some on the left who have been too cavalier about violence, and they should be condemned too. You gotta say this is a Democrat, even though 98% right-wingers doing it, and a marginal 2% in the other direction. But there is no comparison anywhere on the left with MAGA's regular legitimization of violence in our politics. There is a straight line from January 6th to the pardons to the assault on Senator Padilla to Minnesota. A democracy cannot function when one faction embraces violence. I agree. And this is pretty good from Chris Murphy, but I need to see more. So I wrote on Blue Sky, which you should go follow me at, bsky.app/profile/conure.cc. Very simple, very easy. I don't post on Twitter anymore, though my account still exists on there. I do post on Blue Sky and also on community posts on YouTube. I wrote, a proper opposition party would have used its 2020 win to prosecute the entire previous administration as a morally and legally justifiable act of self-defense and defense of country. I believe that's true. I think the January 6th committee was decent. I think they did a fair amount to lay it out for the public, just how bad it was. But overall, Democrats did not do enough. And the Biden administration just sat on its hands because I guess the administration was asleep at the wheel on a variety of issues. I continued, everyday people have always paid the price, but now even lawmakers aren't safe. This is the wake-up call, specifically for them. The GOP are an existential threat and have been for a long time. They have a fundamental contempt for life and either hand-wave away or glorify violence against those they consider their political enemies. There is no room for them in decent society. And I believe this to be true. Obviously, I wrote it, but it is so clear to me that the continued political relevance of the Republican Party is going to destroy the country, if not the world. Republican administrations regularly cut taxes for the wealthy, balloon the deficit, make the economy an absolute shit show, and then a Democrat has to come in and do austerity politics and kind of, make it a little bit better, which is not as good as it could be, but it's certainly better than Republicans. And then a Republican wins and does it all over again. There's a very, very consistent cycle of this. Not only that, their refusal to acknowledge that anthropogenic climate change is a real thing, and the continued use of fossil fuels and not moving away from them to a more green energy option, which would create millions of jobs. There are a whole bunch of different technologies that you could sell to other countries for green technology that would allow you to be a big part of the global economy when it comes to the green energy industry. China seems to kind of be beating our ass on that, unfortunately for the US. As well as the fact that they're seemingly okay with political violence if it's done to the people they don't like. Their hatred of democracy, their hatred of the average person of this country voting against them, and even the ones that vote for them, they hate too. Because if you're poor and a Republican, your boss's taxes are getting cut, so you end up having to foot the bill for a variety of things. When it comes to the tax revenues of the country, the allocation of the meager tax revenues that are gained because of that don't go to a variety of social safety net things that a variety of other countries are able to do to make their quality of life go up, their access to healthcare go up, their access to higher education go up, their ability to create families and raise children go up through paid family and medical leave, all this kind of stuff. All these things that a variety of comparable OECD nations have been able to figure out with less of a, with a smaller wallet, the right wing in this country, and to a smaller extent, the Democratic Party, the liberals in this country, just can't seem to figure out and tend to want to make worse. There are so many things that the GOP does. Their targeting of black and brown people, of minorities, of queer people. Their very violent actions against immigrants in this country through ICE, through CBP. The fact that it was a very common plank, which previously would have ended your political race to begin with for this most recent Republican Party in the 2024 election, to do a mass deportation, which necessitates a whole bunch of violence against black and brown people, it seems, primarily. The fact that people protesting against ICE or against Israel's genocide of Palestine are being black-bagged and sent to El Salvador with no due process. The Republican Party hates this country. They don't like it. The reason why is because they don't like that there's a lot of black and brown people in it. They don't like that there's a fair amount of queer people in it. But primarily, they don't like that there are people in it that disagree with their politics and vote against them. That's the main thing. Very difficult to maintain power if there's a whole bunch of people that don't vote for you. So they do all they can to make it so it's as hard for the people that don't tend to vote for them to vote. And then they also allow for a climate that allows for a lot of room for political violence to be done in the name of, defending against a variety of left-wing shit that they claim to be happening. Like the fact that Hillary Clinton eats children or whatever, or that abortions are murder, even though that's scientifically false. It's absurd that a country would allow for a party like this to continue to have political relevance. But here we are. In my view, the Joe Biden administration and Merrick Garland should have been very excited to prosecute a variety of the people, the elected Republicans, who were complicit in January 6th. You could see, for an example of a country that did this well, was Brazil. President Lula da Silva, after Bolsonaro, who was called the Trump of the tropics, who was essentially a Trumpian figure in Brazil, who got elected for a short amount of time after essentially a coup. I did a video on this a long time ago, back when I used to do video essays, one of my first videos, the reason why the Amazon rainforest is on fire or whatever. It was a judicial coup in Brazil that disallowed Lula da Silva to run for the presidency again. Lula ends up getting through all of that, is able to run again eventually, and then beats Bolsonaro afterward, because he's a very popular, politician there for a variety of reasons. And then he goes on to have his administration do the morally unjustifiable thing, prosecuting the people that were a threat to the democracy of the country, aka the last administration. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do if you gain the presidency that was just not done. Who knows why? Probably because Democrats are cucks. They're cuckolds. They enjoy seeing the country get fucked by Republicans. The actual reason being they are, leashed by corporate interests after Bill Clinton reshaped the Democratic Party, moved them away from unions and union organizing and pro-worker politics. The Democrats end up just being plan B for the mega wealthy in this country, because they know at the very least Democrats will do a variety of things that are good for the mega wealthy, even though they might tax them a little bit more. And even then, not that much. It's not good. And the fact that Democrats are now literally getting killed and attempted to be killed by right-wingers, elected Democrats, you should not allow for the Republican Party, if you are to get so lucky as to attain power the next time after this Trump administration hopefully gets out of there. If you weren't going to do it in 2024, you're going to have to do it in 2028. If the Democrats somehow get power in 2028, and they don't do a variety of things that any reasonable country would do to maintain the ability for a semblance of a democracy to exist in their country, you're never going to be able to do anything ever again. The country's going to suffer, the world's going to suffer, the people worse off in the country already are going to suffer, and I guess that's the price we pay for having the opposition, the de facto opposition party in the United States of America be fucking pussy bitches. I guess that's what we get. Not all of them, of course. Tim Walz is one of the good ones for the most part. It's not good. There's not much else to say. What do you say only works in a two-party system? Yep, which we exist within, unfortunately, in the United States of America. I don't know if you're American or not. The first-past-the-post electoral system eventually, historically, has always devolved into a two-party system. The only way to get out of the two-party system is to move to a proportional voting system, or at least a ranked choice voting system, that allows for third parties to run without being spoilers to their most closely aligned party that has a little bit more power, in this case, the Democrats, if it's a left-wing third party. Unfortunately, that's going to be really hard to do. Democrats themselves are not very excited to talk about electoral reform in that way. Republicans will stand in the way of it. A lot of Democrats will stand in the way of it too. It's kind of like when Justin Trudeau was elected in Canada. He ran on making their elections more robust and reforming the electoral system to allow for parties that aren't the conservative or liberal party, it being easier for them to win, even though their electoral system is a little bit better than ours. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than ours. Even his party ended up walking back on that once they attained power, because they realized that the current electoral system makes it easier for us to win. Democrats understand that as well. They understand that electoral reform in that way might make it harder for them to win if third parties that are further to their left, if it's made easier for them to win, right? The ideal is that at a local level, ranked choice voting or a proportional voting system is put in place. People like it. More local and state level electoral systems get reformed to be one of those systems. More and more people see that it's a better way that allows them to have more say in their government and who they elect to work for them. And then hopefully enough states follow suit that you get it nationally for the general election. But that's a long road to walk. So unfortunately, this is the system we live within. So essentially, corporations that are by and large Republican and prefer the Republican Party because the Republican Party is just the pro-corporation party. The Democrats are also the pro-corporation party, but they have to do a little bit more to appease their voters. A little bit more pro-worker stuff, but on the edges. A lot of rhetoric and not many actions in order to get people to vote for them. Republicans will vote for a fucking pile of shit if it says that it hates brown people at this point. So the unfortunate reality is that the Democratic Party is in a hostage situation with corporate money and corporate interests. And then we as normal people are in a hostage situation by the Democratic Party because of our first past the post electoral system and the de facto two-party system we live in. And it sucks. Like I say, like I will always say, in the primary, vote for the best option in the Democratic Party. Hopefully they win, and you can vote for them in the general election for that. In the general election, vote for the least bad option, which will always be the Democrat, unfortunately. It'll never be a Republican. There are a variety of forms of harm reduction that exist. I do believe that one of the least effective methods of harm reduction is electoral politics, is voting for the least bad option in the general and voting for the best option in the primary. Voting is the bare minimum civic engagement. You do it ideally every 2 years, but most people do it every 4 years if they do it at all. The share of voters in this country end up voting non-voter. They don't show up to the polls, right? That's partially because of a variety of voter suppression that the Republicans do and some Democrats do. A lot of that is also because people got a lot of shit to do. They got a lot of people to take care of in their family. It's hard out there for a lot of people. You got to work long hours for less wages and worse working conditions because of Republican and Democrat policy. There's a whole reason as to why people don't vote in this country. One of the big ones being it's not mandatory, which it should be. Either way, harm reduction doesn't only apply to the electoral system. Organizing in your community, forming community networks with people that are like-minded, that can take care of each other, doing a variety of mutual aid things in your community, volunteering to help the disadvantaged, etc., etc. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you can do as a human being and as a citizen that goes beyond the bare minimum of voting and is often going to be more effective at helping people in your immediate area. And those are the things that you should be doing the other 364 days of the year that there isn't an election for you to vote on. But at the very least, you should be voting for the best option in the primary, so it's going to be the best Democrat, and then vote for the least bad option in the general, which is always going to be the Democrat. Because at the very least, at that point, you're choosing your enemy, rather than, voting for the worst option, I suppose. Either way, I do believe the Republican Party should cease to have political relevance, and I think it would be morally and legally justifiable for the Democrats to have made a bunch of moves to make that the case. After their 2020 win, they didn't do it. The conditions are only getting worse, and now lawmakers are under the crosshair as well, and now that it's directly affecting the Democrats, maybe it'll get their ass in gear. It seems unlikely to me, but hopefully it does a little bit. Silver lining on this horrible tragedy. And, yeah, take care, I suppose, as well as you could be.